Good morning to some and good afternoon to others. Welcome to the two-part webinar series on the upcoming U.S. elections sponsored by the World Press Institute. My name is David McDonald. I'm the Executive Director of the World Press Institute and happy to have all the different participants from around the world. As many of you know, the World Press Institute is a US-based private nonprofit educational organization. For nearly 60 years, WPI has sponsored an annual fellowship program to the US for 10 international journalists, sometimes a few more. And we now have nearly 600 alumni international journalists from over 100 different countries. Unfortunately, the 2020 pandemic caused us to cancel our annual program in 2020, but we have every intention of resuming the program again in 2021. Just a little bit of background. This webinar series is really sort of thought up or as a result of the pandemic, but also as a result of our also postponed journalism conference in Bulgaria. And thanks to the America for Bulgaria Foundation for suggesting this idea and supporting us in part. And also thank you to the Association of European Journalists in Bulgaria for helping publicize and organize this webinar. This is the first of two webinars. We'll have a second webinar with the same speakers and the same format on Tuesday, November 10th, which will be 1 week after the US elections are finished, and we will dissect what has happened. It'll be the same time, 10 a.m. US time Eastern on Tuesday, November 10th. Now I'd like to briefly introduce our two speakers. First of all, the main speaker talking about the US elections is Jim Fallows, and Jim has been a staff writer and correspondent for the Atlantic magazine for more than 40 years. And he's reported extensively both inside and outside the United States. After graduating from Harvard University with an undergraduate degree in history and literature, he went on to get a graduate degree from Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship in economics. Jim, shortly after his education was finished, started working as President Jimmy Carter's chief speechwriter in the late 1970s. For 2 years, he was, I think, one of the youngest, if still not the youngest, chief speechwriter for a US president. Jim has written over 11 books. His most recent book is called Our Town's 100,000-Mile Journey into the Heart of America, and it's the subject of an upcoming HBO documentary. So I think that's really interesting. Jim's written a lot of other books, several on China. He won the National Book Award in nonfiction for his book, The National Defense. He has also written countless magazine articles and won numerous awards for these articles, including a National Magazine Award in 2002 for his story, Iraq, the 51st state, question mark. So now I want to talk just a minute about Michael Montgomery. Michael is also an award-winning reporter and broadcast producer for Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting in San Francisco. Michael graduated from Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, and actually served as a World Press Institute intern, I think his senior year at Macalester. After completing Macalester, he had a Fulbright Fellowship in Eastern Europe and was there in I think it's the 1990s, and stayed on to cover the fall of communism and the breakup of Yugoslavia for a number of newspapers and media outlets, including the Daily Telegraph and the Los Angeles Times. After that, Michael worked as an associate producer on 60 Minutes television show with correspondent Ed Bradley, and as a senior reporter with American Radio Works. As a reporter and a producer, Michael has won a number of prizes and awards, including a Peabody, the Overseas Press Club Award, the Edward R. Murrow Award, and the DuPont Award. Michael has also been a longtime member of the International Consortium of International Journalists. And finally, both of these men are members of the World Press Institute Board of Directors. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the program now over to Jim Fallows for his introductory remarks. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function to send them our way. And after Jim speaks for 15 or 20 minutes, then he'll be joined by Michael Montgomery, who will pose as many of your questions as possible to Jim. Thanks, and looking forward to the rest of this webinar.
Thanks very much. This is Jim Fallows sitting right now in Washington, D.C. I'm glad to join David and Michael and the rest of the WPI team, including our friends in Bulgaria. Sorry we're not there in person, but I'm glad to have this virtual contact. My job for the next few minutes is to try to give a state of play as of 3 weeks before this major U.S. election. The presidential election and many state elections are 3 weeks from this moment in the U.S., even though voting has begun around the country. My wife and I are going to deposit our ballots this afternoon. We're going to have another of these sessions after the November 3rd election. So I'll try to tell you what we think, what we imagine we know, what we don't know, and what to look for in the couple of weeks ahead. I'm going to do this in 4 main segments. First, I'm going to talk about just the election itself, how it seems to be shaping up to the extent people can know 3 weeks ahead of time. Second, I'm going to talk briefly about this odd American institution of the Electoral College and why it's come to prominence in the last 20 years that it had not had for the previous century. Third, I'm going to talk about the things that we don't know right now. What could happen in the next 3 weeks that might change or upend people's predictions or expectations. And then finally, I'll talk about what the outcome of these results might be for the U.S., for U.S. domestic policy, for American dealings with the rest of the world, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my plan, and I'll try to do it as concisely as possible. First of all, what seems to be happening right now? To the extent that the election of 2020 is going to be run on the same basic laws of physics as any previous election in US history, which is an assumption, but let's make that assumption for now. It looks as if Donald Trump is very unlikely, I say unlikely, to get enough votes to carry the Electoral College and be reelected president. Again, I'll get to some of the reasons, that things we don't know in a moment, but the reasons that if this were any other election in any other presidential term, you would think the incumbent were in very bad shape for the following reasons. I'm going to list just 4 of the indicators that people who work in politics judge and that are all now turning significantly against Donald Trump. The first is popularity ratings. Probably since the time of World War II, a little bit before that, but mainly since World War II, there have been fairly accurate measures week by week of how each president is doing on the approve versus disapprove ratio. And they're often related to soundings about how people feel about the country's situation overall, whether you think the United States is going in the right direction or the wrong direction. In all presidents in the history of polling, this is starting with Franklin Roosevelt and then going on through Harry Truman, there has been at least some time when that president was very popular. The president I worked for, Jimmy Carter, back in the 1970s, had about an 80% approval rating at a certain point after the Camp David peace accords. Barack Obama was in the high 80s. Both of the George Bushes, the older one and the younger one, were in the 90s after the younger George Bush after the 9/11 attacks, the older George Bush after the Gulf War. Bill Clinton was in the 80s. These presidents had their ups and downs, but every single one of them at some point had a majority of the American public thinking that they supported him and thought he was doing a good job. Donald Trump has never had a positive approval rating. He has always been below 50%. He has always had more people disapproving of him than approving. That is entirely different from any past presidents. It's allowed him to get into office because of the Electoral College configurations of 4 years ago. But number one, there has never been a president who, by ongoing measures, has been as unpopular with the public as a whole, although very popular among his base. So that is one indication. A related second point has been the political strategy that different presidents have used when they've taken office. Every single one takes office knowing that a significant portion of people voted against him. What's amazing about American elections in popular vote terms is actually how close they usually are. Starting even before World War II, the loser of an election always gets at least 40% of the vote, and sometimes more than that. Even Barry Goldwater in the 1960s, who was very unpopular, et cetera. So every president takes office knowing that a lot of people didn't vote for him. And all previous presidents have then spent the first year or two trying to attract people who didn't vote for them. If Jimmy Carter was a Southerner, and so he was trying to attract some people from the industrial Northeast who didn't vote for him. Barack Obama, of course, was a Democrat, and he was trying to get Republican middle of the road support. I can go on through a long list. The point is that every previous president has thought that his most important task is to expand the base, to draw new people into the tent. What's striking about Donald Trump's strategy has been, it's been 100% intensifying support among the people who are already with him. That has been for previous presidents a sign of trouble. The third indicator on past political physics indications is what is happening to the US economy right now because of the pandemic. The administration points out that 11 million jobs or so have come back in the last 2 or 3 months. But of course, more than twice that many jobs were lost in the beginning of the year. And a very strong pattern in past presidential elections is the level of the unemployment rate has been the most strongly correlated whether presidents stay in, especially incumbent presidents. For the older George Bush, when he was running against Bill Clinton in 1992, Clinton's motto was, "It's the economy, stupid." That's when the unemployment rate was much better than it is now. Finally, of course, there is a historic pandemic in the US in which 200,000 plus people have been killed, schools are closed across the country, et cetera. Without going into any more of the details, I'll simply say, if you were doing handicapping on the base of any previous presidential election, you would say, all of the indicators suggest that that the incumbent is going to have a very hard time staying in. This brings us to point 2, which is it possible still to stay in with a minority of the vote if you win the Electoral College? We know, of course, that that happened 4 years ago when Hillary Clinton got about 3 million more votes than Donald Trump did on a nationwide basis. But because of very close elections, especially in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, Donald Trump carried those states and had a majority in the Electoral College and stayed in. It was the case, I assume that some of you on this call, most of us in this call, must have been alive before the 2000 presidential election, November 3rd or 4th of 2000. That's when George W. Bush and Al Gore were running against each other. What's significant about that date is, as of the morning of that election, when people went to the polls to vote for Gore or Bush or Ralph Nader or other third-party candidates, there was no living person in America who had ever experienced a split between the Electoral College and the popular vote. Because the latest time that it happened was in 1888, and before that it was 1876, and people assumed that the Electoral College was an interesting technicality, but not something that would actually determine who the winner of the election was going to be. Of course, as you know, first with Bush versus Gore in 2000, now with Trump and Clinton in 2016, the past 2 Republican presidents have taken office losing the popular vote and winning the electoral vote. In the case of George W. Bush, in a by very tiny margin. This is a relic of the compromises that led to America's founding. As of 20 years ago, it was tolerated because nobody thought it was actually going to matter. And now we see that it matters quite a good deal. I'll just say 2 other things about the Electoral College before moving on to the next point. One is, there was a moment in the 2004 election. That's when John Kerry, who was, that later became Secretary of State, was running against George W. Bush, who was running for re-election after 9/11 and the Iraq War. And we almost then had the reverse of the Electoral College split. If John Kerry had gotten about 70,000 more votes in the state of Ohio, which is not that many votes in a state that large, if 70,000 votes had gone the other way, then John Kerry would have won the Electoral College and yet lost the popular vote. And because John Kerry was a Democrat, that would have given both parties a reason to say, we have to fix this electoral college. It doesn't make sense. But of course, that didn't happen. There's another plan to try to revise the electoral college, but I'll skip past that for reasons of time. My point number two is the electoral college. If two of the past three presidents have taken office on the basis of electoral college wins, that's why Joe Biden's people think they need to have a very large popular vote margin if they're going to be sure of the electoral college too. Part three, what don't we know right now? The main thing we don't know is about the mechanics of the election. Whether, just yesterday in California, there was some news about the Republican Party setting up false boxes where you could deposit your ballots, and they were just, the ballots weren't going to be counted. There have been rumors all the way along about the postal service being disrupted, or long lines at voting places, and all the other stories you've been seeing. I think that it is sensible for the world and the US to pay very close attention to the mechanics of voting in the next 3 weeks. And that's why so many people have voted already. They wanted to be absolutely sure that they wanted to maximize the chances of their vote being counted. You probably have heard about one particular scenario that's on people's minds, which is a lot of the votes that are cast not in person, but by mail or by other ways other than standing up on election day, a lot of those are not counted until after the main, the same day electoral vote is counted. This is especially true in California, my home state, the most populous state. And this means that often there is a difference between the results as they appear on election day and the full results 3 or 4 days later when all of the mail-in ballots are counted. It's often the case in the last few years that the difference between the same day vote and the full vote later is a shift towards the Democrats. And so there is concern that Donald Trump would be favored in the same day vote and would immediately declare victory, even though there are still many votes to be counted. So I think news organizations are trying to say, how can we guard against this possibility? Something you can watch for is a state that surprisingly does a good job of counting early votes. I say surprisingly because this state, Florida, usually does a terrible job in everything involving elections. But Florida counts its early votes very quickly. So Florida is likely to have its results that same day. The judgment among political people is that if Donald Trump does not win in Florida, then he just cannot win. That there are just, if he loses Florida, there are many, many other states that he would presumably lose too. And Florida's results should be clear relatively soon. So that is a state to watch. But this is the whole category of what we don't know is how the election will take place. This is partly because although the US is a big country, and even though the US has a strong national government, elections are run not by the federal government, but state by state and county by county. So you have thousands of different jurisdictions that are running these elections with very, very different standards. And that's part of the glory of American federalism and also the chaos of American federalism. So finally, point four, the last point, what do we know of the implications of the election? I'm going to speak now on the assumption that Donald Trump is not the next president and that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will take over. I think on the domestic front, what they will mainly be sort of immersed by is the same sort of thing as Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, and to a degree Barack Obama in 2009, which is addressing emergencies and putting out fires. The economic collapse will probably be worse in the US 3 or 4 months from now than it is right now because the Senate is not passing stimulus bills. The pandemic will continue to go on. There will be all sorts of other tensions. So probably domestically, they will be consumed with dealing with emergencies. Internationally, I think the first step will be essentially back to normal, you might say, saying, okay, to traditional allies in the United States, yes, we are still your allies. To organizations from the WHO to the UN, that we want to re-engage with these organizations. So I think that the initial prospect for them would be trying to re-establish some kind of normal baseline rather than the reverse. So there's a lot more I can say, but I want to have time for questions. To sum it up, I'm saying point one, none of us knows what will happen, but the odds seem to be pretty far against Donald Trump right now if there's a normal election. Number two, the Electoral College is a factor, and it's why the Democrats are trying hard for a significant popular vote win. Number three, the thing we mainly don't know is about the mechanics of the election. And number four, the immediate implications are for some kind of return to normal life. And if you want, I can speak about the implications if Donald Trump stays in, but I will save that for later. So that's my opening pitch. We can talk again in a few weeks after we know the results. Michael, over to you.
All right, I hope everyone can hear me. I want to say the sun is just rising in California, so if I can say dobro utro to our colleagues in Bulgaria, and good morning to everyone else. Thanks, Jim. That was actually quite thorough. I want to encourage, once again, anyone who has questions, use the Q&A function on Zoom, please. So I just want to start right off, Jim. You mentioned, and we're reading, that Trump is well behind in the polls. What do you anticipate, not on voting day, but in the run-up in the next few weeks, what are we likely to see in terms of some kind of strategy for him to get back up in the polls and back in the game? What are you expecting?
It appears, so the first point is, it's always been difficult to predict anything about Donald Trump. So we'll leave that on one side. And I have made in my life exactly one prediction about Donald Trump. And that was in the spring of 2015. I said the Republican Party would never choose someone like this as its nominee. I stopped making predictions after that. So with that caveat, it does seem that he has only one move. And that one move is revving up his base. And by his base, I mean, the polls show, for example, he is very seriously behind with women voters. And that especially is the case in the suburban women voters, that is more educated women voters. And the way he conducted his debate with Joe Biden and the way Mike Pence conducted his debate with Kamala Harris was, in body language terms, sort of the least appealing historically to female voters, of being sort of overbearing, of talking over people, especially Pence interrupting Harris. He likes going to these rallies where it's talking about the same things, of sort of praising what he's doing. You would think, if they were trying to address the economic challenge of this moment, that Trump would be doing everything possible to get a big new stimulus bill through the Senate the next 3 weeks. But he, a week ago, announced that he personally was calling off those negotiations. And it's something that's sort of drifted off again, on again. And so the one move he seems to know is kind of inflaming the cultural divisions between his base and the rest of the country. And the challenge is, his base is not most of the country. His base will carry the South and will carry some other places. So if Trump were to pivot towards more normal electoral strategies of trying to expand the tent, draw new people, that would be interesting. I don't think we have ever seen him do that in his time in the public eye.
You touched on this, and I know there's a lot of interest. In fact, there's some, we have one question here, it's several questions, so thank you for that. What are you thinking in terms of the possibility of suppression efforts, obstruction efforts, running up to the vote? You mentioned this situation in California where these mysterious ballot collection boxes have been showing up. It's endlessly complicated. There's around 55 counties in California. The vote, as you mentioned, are organized by counties. It's endlessly complicated. So just go into a little bit about the main areas where we could see,
Yes.
And when I say suppression, I mean deliberate efforts. I'm not talking
Yep.
about, you know, the Electoral College or what have you.
Yep. I think it's important for all of our members here to start with, as I'm sure many of you all with experience in the U.S. do, and so I'm talking to the non-Americans here, Michael, but Americans too, that this is a hundreds of years old tradition in the U.S., essentially of suppressing votes of the other. That are the original voting standards in the United States, yeah, of course, not even counting the population that was in slavery, were for white male property owners. And over time, there became, that franchise was opened somewhat more. It's been 100 years exactly since women got the vote through constitutional amendment. After the ending of legal segregation in the South in the 1960s, there were all sorts of ways in which that were explicitly or indirectly designed to suppress the Black vote, of having polling places that were further away and having poll taxes so that if you had to pay off all your debts before you could vote, and a variety of other things. And I mention all that because it is going on now in several important ways. One was the crucial ruling in a Supreme Court case that I believe was called Shelby County, after a county in Tennessee. This was the one where the current Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, wrote his famous opinion essentially dismantling a lot of the Voting Rights Act that had been passed in the 1960s, saying there's no more need for these sort of prohibitions against racial prejudice in voting because the days of racial discrimination are over, and that we have to recognize that. So that dismantled a lot of federal government supervision. And we have things now like, for example, in Texas, where one of my sons lives, the Republican governor of Texas ordered that there be only one place to drop off your ballots per county in Texas. Now, Texas has a huge number of counties, I think 100 plus or so. But one of those counties, Harris County, is the city of Houston, which has like 5 or 6 million people. So for 5 or 6 million people, they're allowed to have one voting repository. And the idea is this will disadvantage those from the big cities in Texas, which are more minority and which are more Democratic voting. There has been the example from Florida. In a popular referendum, I think 2 years ago, the voters of Florida very strongly approved a measure saying that that people had done their time in prison could regain their right to vote. It used to be that if you had a felony conviction, you had a lifetime prohibition against voting. Again, because of American law enforcement, that penalized more Black people than it did white people, or proportionally. So the Florida population overturned that. But Florida legislators, and I believe now the Florida Supreme Court, keep going back and forth and reimposing various barriers to former returning citizens, as we call them, continuing to vote. The details differ in Wisconsin and in Michigan and in Pennsylvania and other places, but I think that these legal barriers to people being able to vote fairly are what to look for. And the proactive response has been people voting a month early. One other point is I personally will be surprised and of course alarmed if one of Trump's claims to have like armed posses show up at election places. I don't think that will happen, but we have learned to let our imaginations run wild in those days. But that would be really bad if that occurred.
Right, and just to repeat, a lot of these efforts are to make voting more difficult, meaning limiting the number of days for early voting. That's what we saw in Georgia. And I just want to reiterate that these are tiny margins we're talking about, like in Wisconsin, or places where, 20,000 votes, 30,000 votes could make a difference. We're getting a lot of questions. I really appreciate it, everyone. I've got some foreign policy questions. I want to get to that in a minute, both implications of the results on foreign policy, your ties to Europe and Latin America, but a lot of questions about Trump's ambiguity, if you will, about accepting the results. He's been toying with that idea. He's been talking about it before it even happens. It's a fraudulent election, although if he wins, he obviously won't stick to that line. But what's your thinking about this sort of idea that he would not accept a transfer of power? He would not accept the results. Is that actually feasible, or what's your thinking on that?
So there are a lot of different levels in that. And let me start, and I'll try to be more terse than I have been, start by following up on something you were just saying about tiny margins in Georgia and Florida and in Wisconsin and elsewhere. Through most of my lifetime as a voter, people would say, oh, gee, why should I vote? Because it's only one person and billions of votes, or hundreds of millions of votes are being cast. I think there's a different consciousness this time that every single vote matters. Even if it's in a state like California or New York that is going to go Democratic, or a state like Mississippi or Alabama that is going to go Republican, because the margin is going to matter. The more that you can say, the more that it's clear on election day how things have gone, and the more there is a margin, I am assuming, between Joe Biden and Donald Trump in Biden's favor, the clearer cut the results are, and the less likely it is for Republican senators and governors and legislators to try to say, well, it's a close call. Nobody can say what's going on. We're going to steer it in a certain direction. Trump's own personal refusal to recognize anything that could go against him. I think the book by his niece, Mary, is very illuminating on this point, that the nature of his personality is that he can never, and he cannot accept anything in which he is not the winner, the best, the greatest ever, et cetera, et cetera. So that's not an admission one would ever hear from him. I think assuming there is a significant margin, and it matters to get that margin up, you would have Republican senators deciding on that day or the next day not to stand with him. And then the machinery of the Electoral College in December certifying Biden as the winner. And then the process is automatic. The Secret Service is assigned to the person. The Supreme Court Chief Justice swears in the new president on January 20th, and the Secret Service starts protecting that person, and that person lives in the White House, and nobody else can be in the White House. So I think, again, it is a matter of margin. Here would be one consoling example. Remember about 2 or 3 weeks ago when Trump was floating the idea, well, maybe we're going to have to postpone this election, and even Mitch McConnell knocked him down on that. Mitch McConnell is the most soulless person in American politics now. So I took that as Mitch McConnell thinking that was a losing gambit by Trump. So I think it all depends on margin. And I think if the margin is sufficient, even the Republican machinery will work as normal.
Right. And I mean, there's lots of speculation. So let's be fair. What if Trump wins a very narrow, election, somehow pulls it off? There's some shenanigans. There's questions about, whether this was due to suppression efforts. Do you anticipate people taking to the streets and Trump responding with, his own response? I mean, do you imagine any potential for a sort of tumultuous aftermath if Trump actually wins the vote, which doesn't look likely, but it's possible?
Anything is possible. We have, in terms of the political establishment, we have two clear test cases of how the Democratic establishment would respond. Those cases are in 2000, Al Gore accepted the Supreme Court ruling that went against him, and in 2016, Hillary Clinton accepted the results of Donald Trump. So I think the political establishment would respond that way. The public establishment response, or the public response, I think would depend on what would seem to have happened. Because again, for more than a year now, there have been consistent, unvarying polls, all of which have shown Donald Trump at a significant disadvantage in state by state and overall national polls. And there's been I'm not aware of any poll in the year 2020 that has shown him in the lead over Joe Biden. So something would have happened to make the results different. And so I think it just depends. I don't know. Trump's election in 2016 was more of a shock. This would be a different kind of shock. I don't know. I don't know. What do you think, Michael?
I share your idealism, I suppose, if that's what it is. Trump, for all of his rallies and stuff, it's not clear that he actually would be able to bring people out in the streets en masse. I mean, yes, it's possible we might see militias. We saw this in Oregon briefly, where local militias came out and were blocking streets. These things can descend quickly. We saw this in Bosnia, where you had armed militias, then, small areas started, protecting themselves, so to speak, and things can unravel, but the United States isn't Yugoslavia. There's lots of questions about foreign policy implications. Yep. I want to move on to your idea of a return to normalcy under Biden. I think we may get back to some election questions, but there's obviously a lot of our folks on are either in Europe, Latin America. What are we likely to see? Let's start with Europe. What are we likely to see under a Biden administration? A sort of rapprochement, presumably, with NATO. But what are you, big picture, what are you anticipating in terms of foreign policy?
So big picture, I think, would start with a recognition that the U.S. has many built-in assets: its scale, the diversity of its population, its location, blah, blah, blah. You can list the 50 ways in which the U.S. is a fortunate country. But I think strategic people in the U.S. outside the Trump administration recognize that its single greatest advantage has been alliance and soft power. The fact that it's able to leverage other countries' interests and ideals beyond its own brute force. And this has been true in East Asia and the Pacific's been true, of course, most of all in Europe. So I think finding ways to undo the damage, for example, US ambassadors who've been directly meddling in European politics, of having statements of aligning with authoritarian European leaders in Europe and elsewhere. And probably the first step would be, I would think the two first steps would be appointing a State Department staff and ambassadorial contingent who were normal people again. The ambassadors are usually donors. That's just how the world works. But people who have had some interest in the country they're going to or statecraft. But the other would be rejoining institutions. Stop pushing the idea that the main thing about NATO is whether other countries are cheating the U.S. and that the World Health Organization is crucial, and that the EU is more. While their disagreements the U.S. has with the EU, there are very important values, and being willing to speak for shared Western and shared human ideals that are not simply tribal and religious based. So I think that there would be a combination of personnel, statement, and organizational re-knitting the fabric. Those would be the first things I would expect.
What about the situation with our potential adversaries, China, Russia? I mean, those issues aren't going to go away. We don't have to get into trade and all that. But I mean, if Biden does win, there are some serious issues that he's going to have to deal with pretty quickly on the foreign policy front. Yes.
So let me talk first about China, which I know a lot better. I lived there for about 5 years and I've stayed in touch there. I think here are three truths about China that don't neatly fit together, but that's the thing about China. The contradictory realities are true at the same time. The first of those is that whoever was going to be US president for the last 4 years and the next 10 years is going to have a challenge in dealing with China, because it's become a more difficult place to deal with than it was before Xi Jinping as the leader there. It's becoming more repressive internally, more elbows out externally. And so dealing with China is a challenge for anybody who's going to be in charge. Point one. Point two, Trump's policy towards China has been worst of all worlds. That is, it has sounded angry and bellicose, and it's been weak in substance. It's been weak in substance because the Chinese figured out they can buy off Trump through flattery and business deals. So there's been a lot of rhetorical bombast and not doing anything that really matters. The third point I make is that the Chinese are doing themselves no favor either. That right now in many countries of the world, it's a race for the bottom in unpopularity between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. And so there is some opportunity for the US is going to have a challenge in resetting its economic, human, and military balance with China. But I think most people believe there'll be a sort of a tough-minded re-engagement rather than bombast about the China virus and they're cheating us, et cetera, et cetera. With Russia, I think there will be a quite significant recalibration because of the shared sense by almost everybody outside the Trump family that the Russian government has been doing everything it can to support Donald Trump, and that Vladimir Putin is still the only person Donald Trump has never criticized. He's criticized everybody else, but he's never criticized Putin. So I think that there will be a smarter version of tough-mindedness towards China and a significant difference with Russia, just assuming that Russia has become more of an adversary than Trump has let on.
A lot of other questions on that front, but let me get back to, we have a question from one of our WPI alums who's actually, I think, in the US covering the elections. If you were reporting on these elections, Jim, for a newspaper in Poland or Bulgaria or wherever, where would you go right now? I mean, in the run up, and there's also a question about these poll monitors, armed observers coming to the polls. You know, in most places, you're entitled to be there. You can't typically go into the polling station unless you're an official observer. But it could get pretty chaotic. I mean, I've seen scenes. I was in North Carolina in 2016, and you know, there was all sorts of potential for violence. Nothing happened. But where would you go, Jim, if you were covering these elections close up?
So it's an interesting and difficult question for a couple of reasons. One is the U.S. is a giant contradictory country, and every place you go, you'll see a reality of that place, and it'll be different 20 miles away or 100 miles away or whatever. Also, it's the case, my wife Deb and I spent about 5 years traveling around the country to smaller towns, and what we learned is that the thing that you have to do 3 weeks before the election is actually the most difficult journalistic thing to do, which is asking people what they think about national politics. Because our experience is, if you ask people in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, or Columbus, Mississippi, what's happening in the town, what's happening with your school, what's happening with immigrants, what's happening with X, Y, or Z, they have interesting and nuanced reactions. If you ask them Obama, Clinton, Trump, Biden, you're going to hear what you already know, basically. So it is, I think almost any place you go can be rewarding, point one. Point two, I'd look for some place that's in the middle of a transition. They thought they were coming back before the pandemic, and then they're not. Dayton, Ohio, for example, they'd had a long set of troubles. Their downtown has been coming back, and they've been, go to Dayton. I love Dayton. Go to Akron. Go to Erie, Pennsylvania, one of my favorite towns. Go to Charleston, West Virginia. Go to Pensacola, Florida. But then the final point is, when you get there, mainly ask people the story of their lives and the town. Because if you ask them Trump or Biden, they're going to tell you things you already know. And you have to do that sort of pro forma. On the armed observers, most places, I have voted through my life here in DC, where I live, in Southern California, where I grew up, in Texas, where I lived before, in Seattle. All those places, they can have observers, but there's strict rules in every place that I've been. They have to be like at least 50 feet away from the door. And you can't carry weapons, and you can't, make noise and things like that. So I'm not aware of any places where armed poll observers are allowed. And I guess that's one more thing for the Democratic poll watching contingent to be thinking of now. Are you aware, Michael, of places where you can be armed going to be a poll watcher?
Well, depends what we consider poll watchers. I mean, I think that, as I recall, in North Carolina, for example, you could not be within 100 feet of the polling station. But beyond the 100 feet, there are all sorts of people handing literature. And so in an open carry state, I don't know what the legal restrictions would be. And if a group of armed people show up and they're in the parking lot, just standing there, I'm not sure on the legal issues, but I would imagine in quite a few states that would be perfectly acceptable, I think.
It probably would. This is our weirdo country. I guess it's worth recognizing again that over the decades, there are Americans, especially Black Americans, who have endured worse than that in their walk to the polling places, of being yelled at and having eggs thrown at them and all the rest. So this is part of the struggle for democracy.
So I want to ask you about the media. We got a question on this about your Atlantic piece from September. One of our, someone on the call felt you were a little harsh on the U.S. media, but let me just read. I think this is actually from the summary. But you wrote that the media hasn't broken its most destructive habits when it comes to covering Donald Trump. This goes back to 2016. What impact? First of all, explain that, and what impact is it having? I mean, you talked in your piece about this incredible amount of essentially free advertisement that Trump got with all the networks covering his rallies, just nonstop. So you're saying we're seeing that again this time, or what is the lessons that haven't been learned?
I think there were two main lessons of Donald Trump's rise that I was trying to caution with loving concern. I was trying to caution my colleagues to watch out for. Not all of them responded in that spirit, but they will see into the goodness of my heart. One of them was, and I'll take them in reverse order. One of them is falling into the pure spectacle value of Trump himself. And here's what I mean. We talk easily about the categories of news and entertainment without recognizing one huge conceptual difference between them. That if you have a head-to-head conflict or contest in interestingness between entertainment and news, entertainment will always win because that is what it is for. The only thing entertainment has to do is be interesting. And whereas news needs to be as interesting as we can make it, but there are other things, as with education, as with law, as with medical care, whatever, there are other things that have to go on there. And over the last generation or so, more and more of the media have acted as if when there's a contest between entertainment and news, entertainment is what we need to do to survive. And you saw that in 2015 and 16, where Donald Trump rallies, which he did 2 or 3 times a week, they always got big audiences because they were entertaining. And so all of the cable networks, including MSNBC and CNN, which are theoretically more liberal, ran these things, for hour and hour and hour because they were entertaining, and giving, billions of dollars in free airtime for Trump and et cetera, et cetera. And I think there still is the ability of Trump to distract attention moment by moment. And the most recent illustration some of you all may have seen was this helicopter ride back from Walter Reed Hospital. This went right over our house here in DC, the helicopter path from Walter Reed to the south lawn of the White House. Trump timed it to be just at the evening news hours in the US. So it was like 6:30 p.m. And there was about a half an hour of free airtime on all the networks of Donald Trump getting in the helicopter, landing on Marine One, going up to the balcony, giving an address on the balcony, et cetera. So being distracted by spectacle is one. The other is what I was calling this sort of false equivalence of, in much of the media, how much more comfortable it is to feel as if you're just a referee. You're just in the middle. You're saying, here's one side, here's the other. And when one of those sides is basically just telling you lies, minute after minute after minute, you disserve the truth by saying, well, here's Trump saying the U.S. has the best infection record in the world, and here's all the facts saying the reverse. Judge for yourself. Who are we to judge? And so it's very difficult for the press to kind of move out of that stance. It feels like you're being partisan.
You mentioned that, and I think it's true. I mean, I have extended family who have supported Trump, and I agree about the entertainment factor. I think a big change has been COVID. COVID's serious. People know it's serious whether they listen to Trump or not, and I think it's hard for him to kind of get around that with his entertainment. Let me ask a bunch of questions coming in about control of the Senate, the Supreme Court looks, presumably Amy Coney Barrett will be confirmed. Let's start on that. What do you anticipate if it's in a Biden administration? You know, they're being savvy about the issue of, quote, court packing the Supreme Court, expanding the number of justices. What's in your crystal ball? What do you think will happen?
So if I were a Democratic politician or staff member, which I am not in either case, I worked in politics once 40 years ago and then left it behind, I would dismiss any questions about this at the moment. Just saying, in the same way I would dismiss questions, I was saying this in some tweet storm about if somebody asks, would the US go to war if China threatened Taiwan? You say, look, there's no point in getting that kind of hypothetical. You know, just, well, that's the sort of thing where it all depends on how events unfold. So too, I think that it's right for Biden not to get into the future of the court just because it depends on what happens the next 2 or 3 weeks with the Republicans. I personally think there should be a long-term and change in the Supreme Court and a short-term adaptation. The long-term change is fixed life terms for these justices are a terrible idea. This idea was established when the life expectancy was 25 years shorter than it is now. It means that you have essentially actuarial contests to choose justices now. The many people have proposed a plan of having fixed terms of 18 years each. And with 9 justices, that would mean you'd have an appointment every 2 years. So every president could count on an appointment every other year, and you would avoid this horrible sort of actuarial contest we have now. So that's the change that could be done without constitutional amendment. I think that the Democrats, if the Republicans ram through this appointment, having refused to consider a Democratic appointment 4 years ago, I believe the Democrats will find ways to offset that with the composition of the court. And I think they'll do that because, again, to spell it out, the Constitution does not set the number of justices on the Supreme Court. It's been changed many times over the US history, not for more than a century, but it's changeable by the Congress. And so I think they should and will change it, I expect.
All right, just a note, we are getting a lot more questions, so I think we're probably going to go to about 10 minutes after the hour, if that works for you, Jim.
That's fine, and I will be shorter. I'll try to be presidential debate mode.
No, it's fascinating, and there's so much to talk about. Another couple of questions about, couple questions about the polls. You know, there's a sense the polls got it wrong in 2016. There's a debate about that, whether that's actually true. But how confident are you this time around in the polls? You know, we're seeing Biden, the latest, the Rasmussen, I think was 9 points up, I believe, or thereabouts. What's your sense of that in terms of the accuracy of the polls?
So I will avoid terms like confidence or optimistic or anything like that. I'll just say what the evidence seems to show. So looking back to 2016, on a nationwide basis, the polls were pretty accurate. The final election day prediction was somewhere between a 2 to 3.5% popular vote margin for Hillary Clinton, and that's about what she got. And the difference was these hair's breadth outcomes in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Essentially, those were the states, 3 states where by very narrow margins, Trump did better than most polls had shown there. And it wasn't only, I won't go into all the details, but so I think that there were some mistakes in 2016, but the idea that the polls got it all wrong was, I think, overstated. What is impressive this time, I think, is number one, the consistency. I think that, again, I mentioned Donald Trump for four years now almost has never had an approval rating of even 50%. He's always been, as we say, underwater. Since the time Biden became the likely presumptive nominee back in March, he has always been ahead of Trump. And the next point is the margin of Biden over Trump in these polls has been increasing. It's usually the case, it's almost always the case that the margin narrows at this stage of things. That's just how competitions are, at least, and it probably in the next week or two, there'll be some signs of narrowing. But the election in which the polls are most similar right now in my experience, is the 1980 election, where Jimmy Carter was running against for re-election against Ronald Reagan. And that was, people don't remember it, but it was a fairly tight race until about 2.5 or 3 weeks before the election. And there were a number of things at the end which sort of blew the margin open. But it feels to me as if Biden has a growing lead. The Republican senators are acting as if that's true, having taken minor distance from Trump, except on the Supreme Court nomination. So no one knows, and every vote matters, but the evidence seems very different this time from 2016, and 3 weeks from now or plus, we'll know.
Well, just to follow up on that, we got a couple more questions from one of our alum, again, WPI alum, who I think is covering elections here. What if it's not, I think this is quoting the Atlantic again, what if it's not so much a contested election, but that Trump maneuvers it so the results sort of aren't clear, right? And is that a concern? Is there anything that could happen realistically before the election that could hand Trump a victory? Anything, you know, within the realm of
Yes.
the believable?
So, and I think that for those who don't know about it, there was a great cover story in the Current Atlantic by Bart Gellman, essentially on this point of how the real danger is not sort of rigging the elections to be pro-Trump, but having, you know, unclear results, which could allow theoretically some state legislators in Republican-controlled states, starting, of course, with our old friend Florida, America's worst state, but that's a whole different different theme I have.
Oh, you're gonna have some. You're gonna get some email from that, Jim.
I'm ready for it. So, you know, having the legislators say, okay, we're going to just choose the electors ourselves, what the will of the people is not clear, we're going to choose it, et cetera, and then going on from there. So that is, again, why the margin matters. It's worth bearing in mind that a lot of these nightmare scenarios significantly of distorting the U.S. postal system, of you know, intimidation at the polls, of having these maneuvers, unclear results, et cetera, these are coming up 2 and 3 months before the election. So you have a sort of whole legal system and press system and other party system kind of anticipating what they can do. That the other question was, what could Donald Trump do that would transform his fortunes? If there were some vaccine that were available next week and that we knew somehow were safe and that everybody could get, and that it could lead to openings of businesses. And as soon as you mention that possibility, you see all the reasons that can't be the case, because by next week, there can't be a year's worth of experience with human subjects, and you can't get it out to everybody. And so I think something involving the pandemic, so there's too little time, something involving the economy, also sort of it's a very long lead time towards recovery. And so, and international deals, I don't know what, suppose there's some new energy source that entirely obviates fossil fuels. Again, that's a 10-year transition thing. So I can't think of something. I guess if Joe Biden some way became unable to compete as president, you know, if he got COVID and we're really sick, you know, that's Kamala Harris would presumably be the nominee. I think she would arguably be as strong as Biden. She's a very different candidate. You know, she's a younger female Black woman. Biden is the oldest. He would be the oldest president and a white conservative man. But I don't know what might really overturn the table. Do you, Michael?
No, but I think this is a very good question because yes, suppression efforts to constrain the vote if it's close in places like Wisconsin, Florida, those could impact the outcome. I mean, we have that lesson from 2016, but the polls are as they are, and Biden is quite significantly ahead. I was concerned about the potential for violence. Trump really stirring things up, but I'm not sure how that could really impact the vote. Okay, I'm going to blend two questions. I'm getting lots of questions. So let's say you were decided to return to the political sphere and begin writing speeches again. And you're going to write a speech for Joe Biden right after his election. What would be the most important note for President Biden to hit? What would be the most important thing? What would be your advice to him in terms of that speech?
So Biden last week gave a speech at Gettysburg, which was actually quite good, and I thought was a warm-up for an inaugural speech. And its theme was consistent with that of Obama, both in his Obama's famous 2004 convention speech, where he introduced himself to the public, and in Obama's inaugural address as well. And the theme is, we're in this together. Obama's version of that was not red states, blue states, but the United States, and he had a whole riff on that. The way in which Biden has chosen to make this point, I think, is quite shrewd, saying that he's running as a proud Democrat, but he hopes to serve as an American president, that he will be just as attuned to the interests of the people who did not vote for him as the people who did. This is both skillful subtweeting of Trump, who is all, you're with me or you're against me, and it appeals, it's one of two classic American appeals. If you look at American rhetoric through the decades, one of those appeals is there is something in the mythical American ideal, and there is some link that Americans feel when they are overseas and they recognize their commonality, or when they're serving against a threat, or when they're in uniform, or blah, blah, blah. There is something that this country can use to bind its people together, and let's rediscover that. The other thing, which is a very classic American theme, and in great speeches, including Lincoln and FDR and Teddy Roosevelt and the rest, is we are down, but we can come back up. Biden has a somewhat bland term, build back better. But the idea that is a time for America to recognize that it is an entity, a culture, a place that can do things together, and that to recognize it has been down and has found ways back up again. That's what Biden was saying at Gettysburg. And I think a version of that is, if he gives an inaugural speech, what we will hear.
I think you could do better than build back better if you were writing for. Okay, we're getting back to foreign policy. Trump has these curious relationships with, tyrants or, authoritarian, whatever. We see this with Russia, Saudi Arabia, strange bromance, if you will, in North Korea, but also Brazil, and question about Latin American relations. How is that going to shift? I mean, it's hard to imagine Biden having the same kind of personal relationships, although just to point out with Russia, it's not like there aren't sanctions in place. It's not like, right. So how is that going to, I'm talking about we're talking about these countries that really are authoritarian and want to throw in Hungary. Yeah. I wouldn't put Poland in the same category, but how is that going to shift if Biden is elected?
So this is an old problem in U.S. foreign policy. It's been, let's say, at least since the end of the Second World War, when the U.S. has been running its version of an empire around the world, that it has had allies who are very similar in the ideals they aspire towards, starting with NATO and in an increasing number of democracies in the Pacific. It also has imperfect allies. Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, the Saudi empire. You can go down the list of 100. You can go down the list of dozens of other states with whom the U.S. has had to deal. And so it's been a balance over the decades of strategic interest and hopes and conflicts of values. When I was working for Jimmy Carter, I actually worked with him on a big speech he gave at Notre Dame in 1977 about the role of human rights in American foreign policy, recognizing that it could never be an absolute. It was never, an all or nothing, but in the long run, this should be a leavening factor in U.S. foreign policy, that we should say we're going towards these goals. We're going to have to deal with countries whose values are different from ours, but in the long run, we're going to try to stand for some values too. I think, so number one, this is a long problem. Number two, it's different in the last 3 or 4 years because of Trump's personal fondness for leaders whom other American presidents would say, okay, we have to deal with them. We'll figure out. Trump loves these people apparently, and also it's different because of apparently the role of sort of personal flattery and even business deals involving Trump himself. So I think we'll return to the old problem in U.S. foreign policy of recognizing there are regimes the U.S. has to deal with and how to maximize the better in those relationships while recognizing just the realpolitik that is there too.
Yeah, and we're going to just do one more question here and sign off. We'll probably push just a tiny bit past 8:10 here. The big question, you just touched on this. If, I hate, we're only talking about a Biden victory, or we've hardly talked about the scenario for a Trump victory, but you've touched on it. But if Biden does win, what are the likelihoods that we're going to see the Trump family, Donald Trump himself, in trouble with the law in terms of these investigations? We've seen this reporting by the New York Times about potential financial improprieties, to put it lightly. So first of all, could Trump be in trouble legally? And second of all, could you imagine a scenario under which future President Biden would pardon Donald Trump?
I have no secret knowledge about this or inside knowledge, but
because there are rumors about behind, discussions going on behind closed doors on that.
And so on the first point about Trump in trouble with the law, at face value, it looks like he is in serious trouble with the law, and especially with prosecutors in the state of New York. And I emphasize state because, as you know, Michael, but some of our participants might not, a federal pardon does not apply to state laws. So if Trump stepped down and Pence became president and pardoned Trump, if Biden pardoned Trump, that's fine for federal laws, but the New York Attorney General would say, who cares? And all of the fraud laws in New York and corruption laws in New York would still grind on. So it looks at face value as if Trump personally can be in serious legal trouble, and some of his sons too, because they've been running these foundations where there are cases. I don't know about Ivanka. I don't know about how far out. It's significant that it's how many people in the Trump orbit are in prison or pending going to prison. On the Biden pardon, I was involved in the decision by Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter's first lines in his inaugural address in 1977 were to thank Gerald Ford for pardoning Richard Nixon. And that was a sort of controversial at the time. And the idea was to put these things behind us. I don't know whether Biden would pardon Trump. I don't know. Interestingly, it doesn't matter that much to Trump because what he really has to worry about is the state of New York, and nobody has any control over that.
All right. Oh, there's so many more questions. We're getting a lot more in. Okay, I'm just going to ask one more fast one. Good. Just in terms of a Biden win, is something we should be following could you imagine a very serious effort of part of the Democrats to take on the large tech social media companies? And are we, you can just answer this really shortly, are we possibly going to see an attempt to break up some of these companies like Facebook?
Short answer, yes. The longer answer is we're in a situation a lot like the 1910s, 1920s, when huge new monopolies have arisen on new technology, and there was a huge wave of antitrust after that. I believe something like that is ahead.
Great. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Michael. This has been a great webinar. Thank you for everybody who has participated, and we look forward to seeing you again on November 10th.